Hello and welcome to another edition of Mailbag. What is Mailbag? Well, Mailbag is a feature of the channel where you guys leave lots of comments on the channel and I attempt to answer those comments, or if I can't answer those comments, I throw it out to you guys who have more knowledge on some of this stuff than I do. So let's get into the first mailbag of this session. Remember, like, comment, subscribe to the channel. Go over to Instagram and follow me there. Go over to Facebook, follow me there. That's where the normal notices are. And consider becoming a Patreon. Next comment or question, settle in, this is quite a long one. Comes from Imperfect Sequence 7840, and this is in response to playing the Behringer RD8 with your keyboard. A video I did in, good God, September 2020. I didn't realise I had the RD8 that long. Frightening, isn't it, where time goes? As they say, time goes by when you're the programmer of a drum machine. Anyway, Imperfect writes, I don't know if the original had MIDI, therefore it didn't have a MIDI configurations, only triggers. The one that had MIDI configured was the TR-909, which was the first drum machine with MIDI, and later the TR-606 also arrived with MIDI implementation. The RD8 kick drum can be played like chromatic bass. The configuration comes in the manual and is one of the greatest features for people who make drum and bass, trap and dubstep music. Now that's very interesting. I'll have to go back and look at the RD8 manual, because I have to be honest and say I have not used the drum in like a chromatic bass. But if it can be done, I'd honestly like to have a go at it. Another one to sort of chalk up to. Oh, let's go and find out how that works. No, but you are quite correct. The TR-808 was released before the MIDI standard was ratified by the various vendors. And from launch to being discontinued, Roland considered the instrument to be a commercial flop. And there's many people who jump on the bandwagon about why it wasn't, or why it wasn't a commercial flop. Now, it wasn't a instrument flop, you know, because obviously it's a sought after instrument nowadays, but it was a commercial flop. Roland did not sell enough units, and they did not manage to price it properly. I think if they priced it cheaper and people understood actually what the 808 was all about, then possibly there would have been far more units in the market. But that would then mean that all those people who own units now would not be selling their units for $3,000 a pop. But because they were a commercial flop at the time, it's probably why it's now become such a sought after machine, because they could be acquired at this point in time really, really cheaply. And the new dance orientated music scene, because they could buy these things really cheaply, made use of them. And many of the units actually got retrofitted with MIDI in subsequent years to allow producers to control the triggering via MIDI. Now, at the point of release, the 808 had a DIN sync that would operate in an in or an out mode. This allowed for an external time signature to be received by the unit. So if you were running a sequencer, you could take the output of the sequencer, you could take the time code, put it into a DIN sync MIDI DIN sync conversion unit, and then pipe it into this unit, and it would maintain time with whatever else you were running on your sequencer. The unit also had triggers out for controlling other instruments, but that was pretty much about it when the unit came out. Now, as you say, the 909 came out a few years later. The MIDI standard had been ratified at this point, and it had basic MIDI functions built in. But the 909 was also considered a commercial flop by Roland, and also had a limited run. When I say limited run, I mean, you know, I'm not talking about a couple of hundred units, I'm talking about several thousand units or whatever it happens to be. But it was also considered a commercial flop. and I think that's probably why the 606 came out in the form the 606 came out, which is this really sort of TB3 small form factor, rather than this big unit that the 909 and the 808 were. But the question is really, without the TR-808 and the TR-909, would many of the classic dance tunes have existed? And that is one of the things to bear in mind here. The story of the TR-808 and the story of the TR-909 is really the story of how dance music evolved, really, because it was those two drum machines that were taken up by the early dance producers, hip hop, whatever genre you want to talk about, but sort of that late 80s, early 90s era. Those producers bought these units relatively cheaply, modified some of them, and then used these units to create the dance tracks that well, definitely people of my age go, oh, classic tune. Anyway, I got a response. If there were many things written and edited in independent official press, the entire book's about how everything happened, but they do not coincide with things as they actually happened. Many give data from the viewpoint of mainstream world of 80s and 90s, but in the underground we live everything very differently. Now, you see, very interestingly, I suspect imperfect. If I was going to talk to my friend Gary Robinson, many of you probably see comments on the channel from the Death Beats, which is Gary, and and he is a drum and bass producer, composer, producer, artist, and if I were to talk to him about this, he probably would agree with a lot of what's going to be said in the next few paragraphs. But I'll carry on. Starting from the fact that the commercial failure was not Roland's fault. It was not that simple. There were more things added in a time of many changes. It was more due to the bad press and the bad promotion, along with any more things that ruined these machines. Roland only made a CR78 have controls and to be easy operated with the sequencer. This revolutionised everything, soul to soul, with its back to, I think it's back to life, not back to live. And Adamski already used these, although their success was slow. In Belgium, Holland and Germany, the 909 was the king of the castle. They gave birth to EBM and other things with this machine that later ended up in Eurodance, German techno, trance, progressive, minimal, monotone, hardcore, techno, gabba, and the list probably goes on. I don't necessarily, when I think of things, I don't necessarily pigeonhole it into really small blocks. But the failure was also with the TB303 and the TR606. People complaining they were made out of plastic and bad things with ugly sounds, where guitarists hated and felt wrongly cheated in the same way when in Chicago they used them for techno underground. The time where styles like acid house emerged, although before house there was jacking and things that were not known by either names, labels of today. Not even EDM was a nickname or a cliche, and that's more of this century. Music shouldn't be pigeonholed. I've always thought that. Yes, you know, there's house, there's techno, there's garage, but I don't think music should be pigeonholed. Too many people pigeonhole music, and I think that's wrong because it doesn't allow you to cross-fertilise ideas. If you think about it, you know, many a time an EDM producer and a mainstream artist have got together and produced some utterly brilliant records, because it's not EDM, but they take the elements of EDM and they take the elements of mainstream and they kind of blur them together to create some absolutely classics. And I can't for the life of me think of anything off the top of my head while I'm talking. But they do. And it's that cross-fertilisation that makes music fresh. That's my opinion. In the 20th century, the music business works differently depending on styles and subgenres, and this is where it's wrong. Dance music could be anything for dance, but everyone knew it was commercial disco stuff with 909. Nothing to do with music, funk, disco or street music. If you said dance, you were the rare one with commercial tastes. In Chicago, we were more distrustful. Now, I was in America, I was in Detroit, so I kind of saw an underground Detroit scene in the late 90s. Unfortunately, I never really got to see the sort of the underground Chicago scene, but the underground Detroit scene was very, very dance orientated at that point in time. But it was kind of bordering into a rap genre, which I apologise if you are a rap artist and you're watching this channel and you're looking at the equipment, but personally, I don't get rap. Okay, that's me. I love dance, I love electronica, I love house, I love garage. I just can't get into rap, I'm sorry. But, other people like other genres and can't get into the stuff I like. So it is personal preference. Anyway, in Chicago, we were far more distrustful of public opinion, press, and many of us bought these machines on the second-hand market, and there was a lot of house music in those years with the 808 and 909. Hip-hop was also another big trend from 88 to 93. Used these machines, they were at candy prices, but fashion made that ending soon. The TB-303 were vocolas of the 80s. A Sony Walkman was more expensive than this thing, but they rose in price. Oh my God, I can remember the Sony Walkman, how expensive they were. In fact, actually, I looked at something the other day. I was looking at my first Walkman, which I must have received Christmas 1982 or thereabouts, and I got this Walkman, and I thought I was the bee's doodads. I have to be honest. It was a Sanyo Walkman, and it was quite a big unit. But oh God, that lasted for years and years and years until effectively the jack eventually disappeared inside the unit and cracked the circuit board, and it couldn't be repaired. Anyway, so the 808 never had MIDI. The rest did. The problem with the commercial failure was that people in the pop world, 808 seemed very cold, dry, unusable. But then there were people who used much worse things. From there comes unjustified campaign against these rhythm machines, which do not. They were nothing further than the same CR things improved and with a little more control. Well, little more control. But they were defeated, and the result was poor sales and failure that Roland announced. Yeah. There was a backlash. There was a backlash against these machines. But then, having said that, you look at some professional percussionists, and the one that springs to mind completely, Phil Collins. I'm a Genesis nut. Phil Collins would spring to mind. But there were many other progressive rock drummers and rock drummers that used drum machines. Okay? Yes, they played the drums, but they used drum machines. And as Phil Collins put it once, drummers get bored of playing ba-dum, 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 ba-dum. Right? Drummers want to play things where their arms, it's all animal. And there's probably drummers going to shout at me with that. But my friend Mike, who plays in Innovator, he said he gets bored just doing this. He'd rather be bashing things left, right, and centre. So the drummers I know like the drumming to be. What's the word I'm looking for? To have a style. Let's use that. Anyway, the funniest thing is that in the 90s it wasn't better. No one could have something like that, and they became expensive because they were already expensive objects of desire. Used and old things at professional prices, more expensive than the JD800 in 1993. Digital samplers were a fashion things like the Ensoniq ASR10, the Akai S950, the SP1200, the Roland W30. Oh God, I've always wanted a Roland W30. My friend Paul had a Roland W30, and he had it up until a few years ago when some bugger broke into his house and stole it. The Yamaha SU700 in 1998 were expensive machines. These with these machines, many use sound libraries from the 909 and 808, buying CD-ROMs for more experimental and cheap use. Obviously, it was cheaper to buy a CD than the hardware in 1993. I remember that some magazines... Could you get a CD in 1993? I'm trying to think when I bought my first CD. Yeah, you would have been. 1987 was when I bought my first CD. Yeah, God, I'm getting old, aren't I? I remember that some magazines gave away floppy disks and later audio CDs with these sounds on them. Many people prefer to have this so they could better manipulate the sounds that they couldn't manipulate in the same way on an original machine. And the cheapest hardware samplers were not that expensive. Being able to use the 16 sounds of the 808 when you couldn't use the original made a big change. DMC World sample libraries on CD and vinyls, Zero G, East West, Best Service made the most famous sounds for 10 years after the 90s. Now I remember DMC, when I was DJing I used to subscribe to DMC. I used to get all the breakbeats. I got CDs worth of them somewhere. I suspect they're all in storage. I haven't seen them for a while. Since I moved in here, but I suspect they're down in storage and on a shelf somewhere. But yeah, loads of DMC stuff. Oh God, I used to have loads of DMC stuff. I probably still do, as I say, I just don't know where it is. All these sounds were workstations like the Korg M1, the T1, the Arrangers, other Akai digital drum machines. These things were more profitable for the majority, and whoever had an 808 or a 909 was a privileged person or simply a professional guy with a good current account. Well, if you're a musician, if you're an electronic musician, then to be honest, yeah, you do need a good current account because there's always something you want. You just have to sort of kind of, I don't know, build up to it, I suppose. The rest compares a sampler with CDs from libraries that came in a box, all trendy sounds. That was the cheapest way to have a good option for making rhythms. Nobody had an 808 or a 909. Everyone used samples for their trance hits, Eurodance, UK Garage. Things like Technotronic never had these drum machines. All they had was a DX7, an Atari ST 1040 and an Akai S1000. The rest was all professional studio work, and the Belgian Joe Baggerat makes it clear in his interviews. The Belgian Joe Baggerat makes it clear in his interviews. Everything was difficult to buy new things, and his equipment was all second hand for bad 12-bit sound. Those CD libraries from Akai, Roland, EMU, Yamaha were to blame for the fame that Roland things have. Greetings and thanks for the video. Now, if you followed all that, and that was quite a triage, and this video is going to be quite long because I'm looking at the counter and there's still a little bit to go. All I can say is that was a really, really comprehensive response from somebody's point of view, and I have to be honest and say most of that I completely agree with. There's a few bits I don't agree with, but most of that I completely agree with. The commercial failure was that Roland failed to recognise the markets, and I completely get. They didn't understand what it was they were bringing to market and why, and where this would be used. They were targeting the prog rock, the rock drummers, possibly the new romantics, which was sort of kind of around this area. But what they weren't doing is they weren't targeting the creative process, which is why a few years later, when dance came along, you could do a whole dance track in your bedroom. Now, the issue really with these machines was how the sound was generated, and that was kind of the biggest issue. If we take go back a few years, the way the sound was generated was effectively you sampled it, you stuck it on an EEPROM, and then every time you triggered the sound, it basically played that sample from the EEPROM. Now the TR-808 changed that because the TR-808 generated its sound via some sort of analog electronic circuitry, which meant that the tonal qualities of the sound were so much different to the tonal qualities of a sample, which was on the previous style drum machines. And that was one of the things that didn't resonate with the mainstream. The mainstream didn't like this electronic-y thing. But it did work with other musical styles that began to develop around this time. The drier, colder, synthetic sound that they wanted on their tracks. That's where acid house came from at the end of the day, as you rightly say. Now, as these machines became vogue and samples were used to emulate the sound, as I've said, you can only manipulate a sample so far. If you want to change the bass tonal qualities of the samples, you were resampling the instrument. And that was one of the reasons why there were lots of samples of the 808 and the 909, is because what people did is they resampled the instrument with different tonal characteristics, if you like, to try and give people as many different variations of a snare, a kick, a bass drum, cymbals, hi-hats, etc., etc. That could then be chopped and changed in tracks. I mean, it's not uncommon if you go and look at some of these tracks. If if you ever get to sort of listen to the breakdown of some of these tracks, that you quite often hear a 909 bass drum and an 808 bass drum actually set wide in the mix, and you think, well, why they've done that? Because that's what they were trying to achieve, a different sound. Anyway, that was a really, really interesting and long mailbag item, but thank you very much for sending that one in.